What's going on, everybody? Welcome to Fantasy Football Over Analysis. Today we're talking about the Jacksonville Jaguars, their fantasy relevant players, and whether or not we are targeting or fading them in our drafts this summer. At quarterback, Trevor Lawrence finally broke out last season, turning in a top 5 fantasy finish under new head coach Liam Cohen. Lawrence now entering the second year in the system, you hope that there's still opportunity for growth in several areas. The thing about Lawrence last year was a lot of his fantasy value came from the rushing touchdowns he was able to provide. Lawrence scored 9 of those last year. That's a number that he's likely to come down from a little bit this year. So if the rushing touchdowns do dip, how does Lawrence make up for that? And the hope would be that he continues to improve as a passer. Because Lawrence last year, despite a top 5 finish, still didn't turn in great passing numbers. He threw for just above 4,000 yards and only 29 touchdowns. So if in the second year of Cohen's system, if he's able to put up, say, 4,500 yards and 35 touchdowns, numbers similar to that which Joe Burrow typically puts up, and his rushing scores dips from 9 to maybe 4 or 5, then at that point you're looking at Lawrence still finishing top 5 as he did a year ago. Lawrence's cost isn't outrageous in drafts right now. He's ranked as a back-end QB1, which means you can probably get him in the 8th or maybe even the 9th round. And that's not a bad cost at all for a guy that has top 5 upside. Compare that to paying a 4th or 5th rounder for a Lamar Jackson or Joe Burrow, guys who have similar ceiling but also come with injury concern. Whereas Lawrence, you get a 4 to 5 round discount on a guy that has a similar ceiling but also is still in an ascending offense with a good play caller, good weapons around him. I love Trevor Lawrence as a mid to late round quarterback target this year. At running back, the Jaguars lost Travis Etienne or Etienne, whatever you want to call him. For me, I'm going to stick with what it originally was, which was Etienne. So regardless, Etienne is now gone. So that leaves Bashal Tutin, the newly signed Chris Rodriguez, and LaQuint Allen as the 3 running backs in this system. And Tutin is the guy that obviously is going to carry the most upside. Tutin flashed multiple times in a limited role last year. He's the most explosive of the 3. He can handle the short yardage work. He's a decent receiver out of the backfield. But there's still some questions of how the touches are going to be distributed. Chris Rodriguez figures to be an early down guy who's got a history with Cohen. LaQuint Allen is somebody that's got a passing game skill set. But ultimately, when I think about Bashal Tutin, I think about the Chase Brown, Zach Moss situation that the Bengals were in a few years ago, where the Bengals, for whatever reason, just didn't want to unleash Chase Brown right away. They went with Zach Moss, the grinder, the plotter, for probably about half the season until Moss went down with an injury, and then Brown was finally able to be unleashed, and he delivered as a fantasy running back 1 ever since. I kind of think that's what this situation comps to. Even if Rodriguez doesn't get hurt, I think over time, the talent, the explosiveness of Tutin is just going to be such a better fit for the Jaguars, for their offense, for their ceiling, that even if Tutin doesn't start off the year right away as the team's clear RB1, I think by the end of the season he's going to be in that role. Tutin's cost right now isn't bad at all. You can get him in the 6th or 7th round, but even if you're not able to come away with him in drafts, buy low on him if he gets into any kind of slow start during the first couple weeks of the year. The wide receiver situation in Jacksonville is kind of hard to get a handle on, but unlike a situation like, say, the Green Bay Packers over the last few years, where they've had 3 or 4 guys rotating in and out, and it's just an absolute mess to figure out which one is going to go off every week. The Jaguars, all of their key figures in the receiver room are guys that I have some level of interest in. First of all, the cost for these guys isn't bad. Whether it's Brian Thomas, Parker Washington, Jacoby Myers, these are all guys that can be had at a pretty reasonable 7th round cost and on. It's just a matter of personal preference, which one you want to go after first. But I think there's cases to be made for in each wide receiver. And we'll start with the big guy, Brian Thomas. And Thomas last year was one of the biggest busts in all of fantasy football. He goes from being the wide receiver 4 as a rookie to the wide receiver 42 in year 2. He burned so many fantasy managers that took him early in drafts last year. And there were a lot of things going on here. Thomas dealt with a wrist injury throughout the year. He also had some chemistry issues with Trevor Lawrence. The Jaguars also schematically used him mostly as a guy that was going on downfield, clear out routes while Lawrence worked the middle of the field. And there are still legit concerns with Thomas, but the hope is that he'll be better in year 2 of the Cohen offense. The hope is that he and Trevor Lawrence will develop some better chemistry in the offseason. But we do have to acknowledge that those chemistry issues exist, and there's a chance that Thomas could end up being in a similar role to what he was last year. So with Thomas, as much as we're concerned about the risk in drafting him, we also have to acknowledge that the player that finishes the wide receiver 4 and was a high first-round pick for a lot of people in fantasy drafts last year, that player is still in there. And if he's able to bounce back, if he's able to get at least close to what he was in his rookie year, even if he were to finish, say, as like a high-end wide receiver 2, if not a low-end wide receiver 1, to get that in round 7 or potentially later, because a lot of people aren't going to draft him purely because he burned them last year. But if you get this screaming value in the mid-rounds of your drafts, that's a potential league-winning pick. And that's the kind of selection that we're going after. Parker Washington might have the highest ceiling of all the Jaguar receivers other than Thomas. Washington last year enjoyed a breakout late in the season. He works out of the slot, which Lawrence has always loved to target guys out of. Now, the question is, was what we saw in November and December from Washington real, or was it just a flash in the pan? And there is a bit of risk to drafting Washington, like if he ends up being, say, the wide receiver 3 behind Thomas, Jacoby Myers, or what if even Travis Hunter works his way into a larger role than people think. But again, like the cost for all these guys, 7th round or later, it's not a bad bet to make. And we like young, ascending players on good offenses, and Washington certainly fits that bill. And then you have Jacoby Myers, who has always been this solid but unspectacular fantasy asset. Myers is a guy that comes with a safe floor, unlike Washington and Thomas, who don't necessarily have floors attached to them. But Myers, however, doesn't have the ceiling that Washington or Brian Thomas have. But he's a guy that Trevor Lawrence obviously has a lot of trust in. I don't think it's any coincidence that Lawrence started achieving at a higher level once Jacoby Myers was added into the mix last year. And Myers is someone that he's going to return value on where you draft him at. If nothing else, he's going to be a dependable guy that you can plug into your flex or a wide receiver 3 role that is going to go out and get you 10 to 15 points on a weekly basis. And then I want to talk about Travis Hunter for just a couple minutes here. Travis Hunter is someone that a lot of people are going to forget about. There's a decent chance he's going to go undrafted in a lot of leagues this year, and it's understandable why. The offseason news hasn't been great for Hunter. We've had the Jaguars come out and say that they want him to focus more on being a cornerback this year and mix in on certain packages here and there. But we can't forget that Hunter last year, before his injury, was starting to show signs of breaking out of the wide receiver position. And admittedly, it's going to be tough for him to get on the field and get into a regular role behind the top 3 options in Jacksonville. But if there were ever to be an injury to any one of those 3, that opens the door for Hunter to get back in the mix with a regular snap share. And given that he's going to be completely free, Hunter is somebody that I think is a worthy dart throw at the end of drafts, if nothing else. And then at tight end, I love Bretton Strange as one of your options for a late round tight end build. Strange again, fits this offense very well. He just signed a contract extension with the Jaguars earlier in the offseason. Again, the rapport is there with Lawrence. Strange, he missed some time with an injury last year, but when healthy, he was as key a part of the Jaguars' offense as anyone. So, again, as a late round target, Strange is definitely one of those guys in the same tier as like Chikakonkwo, Mark Andrews, Travis Kelce, guys that you can take in the double-digit rounds that are more than likely going to return value at the tight end position. That's going to do it for this one, guys. So with the Jaguars, this is such a unique situation from a fantasy perspective. It's not too often you see an offense that's regarded as a top 10 or a top 5 offense where you can get exposure to the pieces of that offensive environment from like the later than the 5th round and on in drafts. Like whether you want Trevor Lawrence, whether you want Bashal Tutin, whether you want any of the wide receivers, all these guys can be had from, I'd say, even like the 7th round and on. And my takeaway with the Jaguars is just get some kind of exposure to them. Whether it's at least one of these guys, whether it's one of the receivers, the running back, maybe Trevor Lawrence is your preferred option at quarterback, even Strange as a late round tight end. Just come away from your drafts with some kind of exposure to Jacksonville this year. But again, that's going to do it for this one, guys. I thank you so much for watching, and we will talk to you next time when we go over the Indianapolis Colts.